Hello everyone, this is Grunch, and I am back with my final Gatecrash draft preview. This time the blue and Dimir cards, which I saved for last because they are the most difficult to figure out. The other four mechanics all sort of relatively push you in a fairly obvious direction. Cypher is really not a build around, and the mill deck kind of splits between some of the damage pushing things, kind of a tempo deck that can be built, versus a mill deck, so Dimir is kind of a guild torn in half and kind of complicated, so let's get started. First up, we have Aetherize. 3 colorless and a blue for an instant, uncommon. Return all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. So I think this card is deceptively powerful. I think it's probably better in this set than it would be in almost all others. It's obviously going to wreck Battalion because their Alpha Strike just goes back to their hand. If you catch a Blood Rush effect with this, they're trading your Aetherize for their guy, and they're also set back pretty far in tempo, so that's pretty sweet. If you reset an evolved creature or two, you've gained quite a bit of time, and they may not be able to replace those counters. Not the greatest against Orzhov, though, because you're putting something back in their hand for them to cast to get more extort triggers. But it does wreck Cypher, so against 4 of the 5 mechanics in the set, pretty sweet. Not a super high pick, but if you can get this mid-pack, I'd pick it up. Moving along, we have Agoraphobia. 1 colorless, 1 blue for enchantment. Enchanted creature gets -5, -0. You can play a blue and 2 colorless to return Agoraphobia to your hand. It's an uncommon aura. So this card is pretty good. It basically shuts down an attacker early in the game. I mean, if you never played Innistrad, you may not appreciate sensory deprivation, and, well, this card isn't quite as purely efficient as that. It's got a lot more late-game potential in resetting and such, and if you're trying to get really cutesy, you can put this on an evolve guy to make sure they evolve basically no matter what you play from then on out. But overall, it's not quite removal, so I wouldn't pick it too super high. So next we come to Bane Alley Broker. 1 colorless, a blue, and a black. For an 0/3 creature, tap, draw a card, then exile a card from your hand face down. You may look at exiled cards that are face down with Bane Alley Broker. And you can pay a blue and a black to return a card that you exiled with Bane Alley Broker to your hand. So this is a looter with significant upside. The reason that looters don't just say tap, draw a card, in addition to the fact that that would make them broken, is that it forces you to make interesting decisions. But this little princess doesn't even force you to do that. You just get rid of things you can't use now, and then later you get back the things you couldn't use earlier. So she's not quite tapped to draw a card, but the longer the game goes, the more value she gets. I think this is a pretty sweet card if you're already decided to go Dimir, but not quite strong enough to make you want to go Dimir over one of the other guilds. Staying in the theme of awesome in Dimir, but I'm not sure it forces you into Dimir, is Call of the Nightwing. 2 colorless, a blue and a black. Put a 1/1 blue and black horror creature token of flying onto the battlefield, and it has Cypher. So, unlike almost all the other, I think literally all of the other Cypher cards, this makes an evasion target for its Cypher. That's really not ideal, because you'd rather cast it twice in one turn, so that you get sort of at least a midnight haunting out of it. But that's still a pretty good backup plan in case your opponent has removal, or you've just been getting brick walled the whole time. I still don't think this card is insane, but it is pretty good. It's, again, difficult to evaluate because it's not helping you mill your opponent. It's not removal. It's not super aggressive tempo, although it does provide a steady stream of chump blockers, so if you're building sort of a evasion skies tempo deck, this offers some defense as well as offense if you have the opportunity. I think this is a pretty good card, but I don't think you want to pick it super early. I think if you've decided to go Dimir, this is a card you pick, but you don't pick it super high. Speaking of not picking something super high, we have Clinging Anemones. 3 colorless and a blue for a 1/4 with Defender and Evolve. So in this set, it looks like things are going to be pretty aggressive. And so in that vein, a 1/4 blocker is probably more valuable than it would have been in previous sets, but this is still 4 mana for a 1/4. Yes, it evolves, but it only sits on defense. Yes, it has a 4-butt, so it can help evolve other creatures with Evolve, but it costs 4, which means it's, not coming down super fast. This is pretty marginal guy, and I feel bad if you feel like you need to take this early. Something you can feel a lot less bad about taking early is Cloudfin Raptor. 1 blue for a 0/1 flying Evolve. I think this guy is going to be one of those mainstay, staple, early pick commons for the Evolve deck. You want evasion, you want to get something on the board so it can grow early. This is pretty much everything you want for that deck. However, I think this is also a pretty high pick for Dimir. This is the cheapest evasion creature in the set, and it grows to be something relevant, yes, even off Dimir creatures. It's a pretty good target for Cypher, and if you end up in the evasion removal tempo style Dimir deck, this is still pretty good there. So I think it goes in both of the blue guilds relatively high, which means you're going to have to take it relatively high to get it. Something you do not have to pick high to get is Coerced Confession. 4 colorless and a blue and black hybrid mana. Target player puts the top 4 cards of his or her library into their graveyard, and you draw a card for each creature card you put into the graveyard this way. So Battalion and Blood Rush both, as well as Evolve, kind of push you to want to play a lot of creatures. But even at a lot of creatures, 20 is almost the absolute high end of what we could expect. You're not going to see too many draft decks that are 22 creatures, 2 spells, and 16 land. I don't think that's a terribly common occurrence. And so, Coerced Confession is probably good for about 1 card, sometimes 2, so maybe you draw a card and a half on average off of this. Which means it's really crappy card drawing. So you have to desperately want the mill effect. Now, something of a spoiler, there is going to be a card coming up a little bit later that lets you potentially put creatures on top of people's libraries. And so if you're doing that, Coerced Confession is guaranteed to draw at least 1 card. And that's a pretty okay setup, but you're still working awfully hard to get card drawing off of this. Moving along, we have, thankfully, a good card, finally, in Death Cult Rogue. 1 colorless, 2 blue and black hybrid mana for a 2/2. He can only be blocked by rogues. So I know what you're wondering. Well, Grunch, how many rogues are in this set? Well, there's 10-ish. I didn't do an exact count. But they're almost all in blue and black. And if you're the blue and black deck, you're probably the guy with the rogues. So this is definitely better than Intimidate, and definitely better than Flying, because there's far more than 10 flyers. I almost want to say this is close to unblockable, but not quite there. Which means it's a pretty good little clock for your opponent, and a quite solid target for Cypher. But again, you're Dimir, so this isn't a super high pick. I'm not picking this over a staple common for another guild, unless I'm already Dimir for some reason. So next, we have the Dimir Guild Charm. And yet again, I feel as though the Dimir Guild has gotten the short end of everything. First mode, counter target sorcery spell. There's a surprisingly low number of sorceries in this set. A lot of the removal tends to be either an aura or an instant. There are some sorceries, but there aren't as many as there are in some sets because of all the auras and instants. Destroy target creature with power 2 or less. Alright, that's SWAT. SWAT's playable. And then look at the top 3 cards of target player's library, put 1 back and the rest into that player's graveyard. So, if you're just all in on milling your opponent, this mills for 2 and then puts on top of their library something they'd rather not draw. So if they're missing land drops, you can, mana screw them, and if they have no gas, you can force them to draw more lands. But overall, I think this is the single least impressive charm of the entire 10 charm cycle. Next up, we come to, finally, an impressive Dimir card. Dinrova Horror. 4 colorless, a blue and a black, uncommon creature horror, 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, you return target permanent to its owner's hand, and then that player discards a card. So if you have your opponent hellbent, this is just a Vindicate on a 4/4, which is outstanding. But even if they're not hellbent, it's still Recoil on a 4/4, and Recoil was great back in the day. This is for 1 more mana, 1 black mana more than a Void Wielder from Return to Ravnica, you get a much bigger body and a free card out of the deal. I think this card is fantastic. It is 6 mana, which means the format might just be too fast to rely on this to save you, but as part of a grinding control strategy, I think this is fantastic. So if you manage to get that deck, this card will be amazing for you. Sadly, we now go back to a cycle where the Dimir have the worst. Duskmantle Guildmage, templated like the other Guildmages. First ability, a colorless, a blue and a black. Whenever a card is put into your opponent's graveyard from anywhere this turn, that player loses a life. So this turns mill into damage. And then 2 colorless, a blue and a black. Target player puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into hers or her graveyards. This lets you mill. And this highlights exactly the tension the Dimir Guild suffers from. Are we trying to kill him with damage, or are we trying to kill him with mill? Doing both requires 7 mana, and then they take 2 damage and mill 2 cards, which is just not worth 7 mana. If we could decide on a pure direction, if the cards were sort of dedicated towards one end or the other, then we would know what to do with it. But since we don't, this card's going to be kind of dependent on context. Not even necessarily on the context of your deck, but even just on the game state and turn to turn. So these cards are just really difficult to get right, which means they're probably not that great in the first place. Moving to something we do know is great, we have Frilled Oculus. 1 blue, 1 colorless for a 1/3, and you can spend a green and a colorless to give it +2/+2 until end of turn, but you can only do that once each turn. So Lumen Grid Warden / Maritime Guard is something we'd already want in this set because of how aggressive it's looking to be. And the potential for our 2-drop to later be as big as almost any other creature coming out in the set is fantastic. I think this card is a very high pick for the Simic decks, which means that even though the Dimir decks probably wouldn't mind a Maritime Guard, they're going to have to struggle to get it because the Simic decks are going to be picking him out of the pack so much higher. To be honest, this is the kind of common that makes me suspect Dimir is supposed to be played as a 3-color deck, sort of splashing green or splashing white into your blue and black deck. Because if you have to play a 3rd color to get your best cards, you have to play a 3rd color to have any good cards. Speaking of having to struggle to have good cards, we have Gridlock. X in the blue, instant uncommon, tap X target non-land permanents. Man, look how far blue has fallen since the days when we used to get to play with sleep. This card is probably not playable. I hope for your sake you don't have to play it. Moving along, we come to a much better way to tap things. Hands of Binding. 1 colorless and a blue, sorcery, common. Tap target creature and opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step, and it has Cipher. So this is pretty sweet. It's almost removal in that if you're hitting every turn with some evasion guy with this ciphered onto it, you're locking down their biggest creature every turn. And the turn that you cast it, it taps something to help you get through. So if, say, you have a flyer and they have a flyer, you tap their flyer, put this on your guy, tap whatever other blocker they have, and then from there on out, you just continuously lock their flyer down to get your flyer through. I think there is a tempo blue and black Dimir deck to be had, and I think this is one of the commons that pushes you that direction. This is probably also fine in Simic. Not as high as it could be in Dimir, simply because you lack evasion guys, but it's still a tempo spell, and this is looking like it's going to be an aggressive set. So I think this is one of the better blue commons. Next we have something that I've heard some people say they like, but maybe I don't get it. Incursion Specialist, 1 colorless and a blue, 1/3. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, Incursion Specialist gets +2/+0 and is unblockable until the turn. So as I said before, we probably want a Maritime Guard, and maybe that's a good chunk of why people like this card. But casting 2 spells in a given turn is not easy to do in Limited. It's actually kind of difficult. Especially to do it early in the game or to do it repeatedly later. +2/+0 and unblockable is pretty sweet. That makes this guy a clock, but it's not reliable, and it's not going to happen all that often, which makes me think this guy isn't a super high pick. How bad do you need a Maritime Guard? That's roughly how bad you're going to need an Incursion Specialist. So next we have the Keymaster Rogue. 3 colorless and a blue, human rogue common, 3/2 creature. He's unblockable, and when he enters the battlefield, you return a creature you control to your hand. So this guy is pretty powerful. Unblockable 3/2s are decent clocks. He returns a guy to your hand, sounds like a drawback, but there are several ways to utilize this, and the most obvious of which is to continuously recast him, or even just have a stream of creatures to cast to keep evolving your other creatures. And that's pretty sweet. I think this guy, though, for how good he might be in Simic, is going to be more of the Dimir aggressive tempo deck, where you need these evasion guys to get your Cypher spells through, and being unblockable basically says removal or he's getting through, so not a super high pick because the tempo implications are not positive, but you're going to need this guy. Something I hope the blue decks don't actually end up needing, we have Last Thoughts. 3 colorless and a blue, sorcery, draw a card with Cypher. So you have to immediately hit with the creature to make this the equivalent of a sorcery speed inspiration. That's pretty bad. And you have to hit again with it to make it actually value, to make it sort of worth the work you have to go through to make this happen. Now if you're hitting every turn, you are drawing twice as many cards as your opponent, which means that even if your cards are worse than those, because you're playing Dimir, so you just have worse cards, thanks Wizards for that one, you probably still can pull out a game where you're drawing twice as many cards as your opponent. Although maybe not. This is a very fast set from what it looks like, and this is kind of the opposite of how you advance your board state tempo-wise. This looks like the kind of card that gets you set up to get completely wrecked by some removal spell. It's not that this card is unplayable. I think it's going to be played. I just think it points to kind of a sloppy or perhaps frustrating design on the part of Wizards. Something that seems also frustrating design, but I think is actually a little more useful, is Leyline Phantom. 4 colorless and a blue for a 5/5. Whenever it deals combat damage, you return it to its owner's hand. So the obvious sort of immediate use for this guy is as a big dude in your Evolve deck that if your opponent dares Brumble with, you get to continuously evolve your other guys. And this is probably fine in Dimir because a 5/5 does go a decently long way towards creating a disincentive for your opponent to Alpha Strike. Though, if you have to recast this every turn, you have to hope they're throwing creatures into it every turn, otherwise you're not actually making any headway on the board state. And you're still trading 5 mana for their cheaper guys. So you might just get run over in the meantime. Moving along, we have the Metropolis Sprite. 1 colorless and a blue for a Fairy Rogue common. 1/2 with flying, and you can spend a blue to give it +1/-1. This card is just kind of bad. It's a flying squire. Yes, okay, it's an evasion creature that you can put your Cypher spells on, but you're working pretty hard to make a Metropolis Sprite and a Last Thoughts actually valuable together to be sort of one okay card. I don't like this guy, and I think if you end up having to play him, you're not going to like where you're at. Something I like a decently amount more, We have Mind Eye Drake. 4 colorless and a blue for a uncommon 2/5 flyer, and when it dies, you get to mill your opponent for 5. So, this isn't Bell Tower Sphinx, because Bell Tower Sphinx did this every time they attacked. But a Sky Ruin Drake is still pretty good in this set, because it kills grizzly bears and blocks medium-sized guys, and these are both rather valuable things to do. Having flying means he's could potentially be a guy to pick up your Cypher effects, although at 5 mana, that's relatively slow for the format. I like this guy, but he's uncommon, which means that you just have to pick him a little bit earlier. There aren't going to be that many of this guy in this set. And I think the fact that they put this kind of creature at uncommon kind of speaks volumes about what they wanted the strength of the Dimir decks to be. Next up, we come to one of the biggest puzzles in this set. Mortis Strider. A colorless, a blue, and a black. A 1/1 skeleton common, and when it dies, you return it to your hand. So, I think this card, more than perhaps any other in the set, is going to be one of those cards that if you figure out how to use this, not the obvious way, but what the real core of what this guy does, how best to utilize this creature, you're going to be way ahead in Limited. Because it kind of seems like it's just a chump blocker repeatedly for 3 mana. That's not terrible, but the fact that it dies and comes back to your hand means you're casting a guy more often, and there's got to be more going on here. It does trigger Extort over and over, so if you're in kind of a 3-color and Esper deck, so to speak, this is a pretty strong disincentive for your opponent to attack, because every time he does so, you just get this guy back and get to extort him some more. So that might be part of it. And stalling the game out for the Dimir decks might be part of it, but there's got to be some fantastic engine here that saves the Dimir guild, right? Right, Wizards? Right? Speaking of please save the Dimir guild, we have Paranoid Delusions. 1 blue and a black. Sorcery, you mill your opponent for 3, or you mill yourself for 3, I guess. Mill someone for 3, and then you have Cypher. This card seems like it conflicts directly with Shadow Strike. Shadow Strike's going to kill people real fast. This card doesn't kill people real fast. I mean, this probably needs to hit 7 or 8 times to mill him out in Limited. That's a lot. That's a lot of hits. A 2/2 hitting 8 times does 16 damage. Okay, you get 1 for free, so hitting 7 times. 14 damage off your Death Cult Rogue before you mill them with Paranoid Delusions. This card could have done 4. It could have milled 4, and it would still have been a relatively marginal card. Speaking of marginal cards that they just could have made more aggressive, we have the Psychic Strike. A colorless and a blue and a black. For an instant, counter-target spell, its controller puts the top 2 cards of his or her library in his or her graveyard. Now let me be clear, I like this card because I like Cancel in Limited, and because milling your opponent on something that's already worth doing is one of the ways I could see the mill decks getting there. So Psychic Strike and Balustrade Spy and Grizzly Spectacle all point towards maybe being able to build a control deck that incidentally kills with mill. Alright, sweet. And then you get to turn on your Death's Approaches. Alright, I can see that. But my question is this. Why couldn't this card have cost just a blue and a black? I mean, we're already playing this crappy Dimir guild. Couldn't we get paid off for it? No. This card counters spells. They weren't going to make something that counters spells good. I mean, come on. So next up, we have Pongify, renamed as Rapid Hybridization. 1 blue, destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated. And they get a 3/3 frog token. I shouldn't have had to read that. If you don't know what Pongify does, you're just a child. Just an ignorant child. You know nothing of the world and the ways. Anyway, this card's pretty sweet. Blows out, Blood Rush. Yeah, I don't know. I think giving them a 3/3 is sometimes going to have to be done, but I think this card's overrated in general. I don't want my removal giving my opponent 3/3s back. So next we come to a halfway decent Dimir card, perhaps finally. Sage's Row Denizen. 2 colorless and a blue for a common 2/3, and whenever another blue creature enters the battlefield under your control, you can mill someone for 2. So this is a pretty solid early game blocker, and then a way to advance your milling strategy into the mid game. I like it. I think, sadly, it's one of the few Dimir cards that I do like, and this is going to be a much higher pick than a similar effect in another guild would have been, but this is kind of what you got to do. So next, we have the Sapphire Drake. 5 colorless and a blue for a 4/4 with flying, and each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter gets flying. So this is an air elemental, although it costs 1 more, but even at 6 mana, 4/4 flyers and limited are generally pretty strong, and if you're playing Evolve, this is basically going to give you guys all flight. I think that's called Levitation Homes with mind bullets. Anyway, this guy's pretty good in Simic. Not as good in Dimir, I don't think, because most of your creatures sort of already come with evasion, and 6 mana is kind of a lot, but you'll still probably play it there. I don't want to pick it super high if I'm Dimir, but if I'm Simic, I do, so kind of lets you know where it's at. Speaking of letting you know where things at, Scatter Arc. Blue and 3 colorless, instant, counter target non-creature spell, draw a card. Common. Negate is a passable sideboard card in Standard. This is a passable sideboard card in Limited. But why did it have to cost 4? I mean, come on. If it cost 3, it might actually be a playable counter magic in Constructed. And I understand that they don't want that. They don't want counter magic to be playable and constructed, but it's healthy for the game. And I mean, come on! Non-creature spell. You already had Cavernous Souls. We couldn't counter creatures anyways. Creatures are uncounterable already, so all you can really counter are, like, other people's blue spells. You should just say counter target blue spell or Planeswalker. Come on. Alright, so we have Simic Flux Mage, 2 colorless and a blue, 1/2 evolve. Blue and a colorless, tap him, move a +1/+1 counter from him to target creature, uncommon. Kind of actually expensive for an evolve guy, like 3 mana that at a 1/2 he isn't going to evolve anybody else most likely, and isn't very big on about turn 4, means he's kind of mopey. I get that he can move counters to other creatures that are more useful, but I think overall this guy's just trying to work a little too hard to get what you want out of him. I can think of about a half a dozen other evolve guys that I would rather have, and I'd probably rather have a Sage's Row Denizen in most circumstances, even if I'm in a freaking evolve Simic deck. So this guy's pretty... Staying with the mopey blue cards theme, Sky Games, colorless and blue, common, enchant land, and the land can tap to give a guy flying until end of turn, so you can sort of jump continuously, I guess. I mean, Flight cost 1 blue mana and didn't have an upkeep of tap a land. Why is this... Okay, it's on a land, so it's slightly less likely to give you 2 for 1, but all the good blue creatures seem to come with evasion anyway. What's the point? What's the friggin' point, Wizards? Alright. Spell Rupture. Colorless in the blue. Common. Instant. Counter target spell unless its controller pays X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. This might actually be a main deck playable counter spell, but I'm not going to promise that. Maybe. It's probably okay in Limited. It's probably fine in Limited. Might, maybe, just maybe, be good enough for Standard. But we'll see. We'll see. Remember, creatures are uncounterable. Always. So, you may not get to rupture any creatures. Next up, we have Totally Lost. 4 colorless on the blue, instant, common. Put target non-land permanent on top of its owner's library. So, this is kind of a wrecking for Blood Rush. Kind of wrecks Evolve too. Works with the mill mechanic in that if you do this and then Psychic Strike something else, or Sage's Row Denizen, you've actually gotten rid of whatever it was you wanted to get rid of. I think this is an alright card, but it does cost 5, so it's not the greatest. And if you don't have a mill effect, you didn't actually get rid of the problem. It's coming back. Sorry if this video is seeming like a downer, but, well, here, let me evaluate Void Walk. 3 colorless and a blue, uncommon sorcery. Exile target creature, return to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. Return to the battlefield, the next end step. And then Cipher. So, this can get a blocker out of the way on the one turn that you cast it, and then from there on out, you're ciphering to put stuff back into play on your end step, so you can maybe build Vigilance-ish, sort of. Maybe. There aren't enough enters the battlefield triggers in this set for this card to be sweet. I'm sure somebody will get there once, and it'll be kind of sweet. Okay, maybe you're void walking your Leyline Phantoms so you don't have to recast him. Talk about using 2 terrible cards to combine to make one less terrible. And now we come to the last card of the video, and the last blue card, thankfully. Way of the Thief, 3 colorless and blue. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2. And if you control a gate, then that creature is also unblockable. And this is an aura. It's a common. Auras have an awful lot of risks involved. Your opponent might void walk your unblockable guy, then you just get wrecked. I mean, I get that they want this gate theme in the set, but like, you compare this to Celestial Mantle that white doesn't have to have a gate for, and gives you way more than unblockable and protection from creatures. It's just seems like the Dimir Guild got some hate in this set, and it's gotten a lot of hate from me in the evaluation. I think figuring out how to draft Dimir successfully is going to be one of the big challenges in this set, and I hope this video maybe somewhat helped you get there. So, thanks for watching.